In this video, we're going to take a look at some HTML tags that everybody should know. A few references that I found helpful. First, W3C Schools has a lot of good tutorials on HTML. Also, echoecho.com, and a lot of this I built into one of the very first courses I taught here at UC, Fundamentals of the Web, where we're talking about HTML. So the nice thing about HTML is it's very frequently used, so there are a lot of good resources on it. One other really good resource is Control-U in most browsers, which will show you the HTML behind a web page, or if you want, Control-Shift-J in Chrome will take you to developer mode where you can take a look at the HTML that creates a page. You can actually select one thing at a time, and you can see what it is selecting on your page. Another easy way to get to this Explorer is to right-click and simply say Inspect. And it will take whatever you were clicking on, which in this case was the Cercis Canadensis, and it will highlight that directly within the HTML. So you see, as I'm mousing over here, it's pointing out what each of these elements are in my page. So that's a really handy way to learn a bit of HTML, is just look at what's already out there. So those are some good resources for learning HTML. Now, there are many good tools available where you can build an HTML page. All you really need is a text editor. But there's some tools from Adobe, there's some from Microsoft like Expression Web, and then also Visual Studio. Some of the normal IDEs will let you write HTML. In our example, we're going to start with a page that we created in Notepad++. You see here a very simple HTML page, and we're going to add it to a Razor Page project in Visual Studio. But here again, if you're not using Razor Pages, not to worry, just think of this as a text editor. So first of all, I right-click and I choose Copy. Now I go to Visual Studio, and this is an existing C# Razor Page project I've been working with. I simply go to the www root folder, which is where I put any kind of static HTML that I want to use. And I choose Add, and we'll say New Item. Choose HTML from the dialog box that appears, and I'll simply call this one index.html, and then Add. You see, it gives me a bit of a starter document, which is very similar to the one that I created in Notepad++. So I'm simply going to merge these two together. I'll delete everything except that doc type element at the top, and then simply paste in my changes from earlier, and save. Tidy up the tabs a little bit. Now, one nice thing is that I can look at this in Chrome or any browser of my choice by simply right-clicking on the file and choosing View in Browser, and it'll give me a look and feel of what it looks like so far. So no surprise here, a very straightforward HTML page. Now, HTML should really be used to structure the content of an HTML document, but it should not directly be used for styling. In other words, we shouldn't put font information directly in HTML. What we can do, though, is use tags that mean special things that have a default styling, and then we can change that styling in CSS if we want to. We'll talk about CSS in a future video. But nonetheless, let's consider some parts of text. First of all, for text, we have H1, which is the largest text that we'll see by default. Heading 1 means it's the most important. Then H2 means heading 2, H3 heading 3, all the way down to H6, which is the smallest type of text. But when you think of headings, think of a table of contents. Like a heading 1 would be a chapter, and then a heading 2 would maybe be a subchapter within that chapter, and then a heading 3 would be maybe a section within that subchapter within the chapter. So that's how we're trying to organize our thoughts. EM, that means emphasis, which by default is italics. This replaces an old tag that we used, which was an I tag. The I tag directly meant italics to most browsers, but remember, that's specifying a font, which we don't want to do. We'd rather just say, emphasize this some way, and that way, by default, could be italics, but that default way could be changed through CSS. So if we look at our existing page, we'll see that we have H2 and EM, and let's see how that's represented. Our H2 is rather large, and then the EM is in the near future. And remember our inspector tool. If I go and inspect that, you notice that that is covered with an EM. If we go up to our H2, you see that that is covered with an H2. One neat thing that we can do in this inspector, by the way, is we can play around with different things. What if we change this to an H3? you notice it gets a little bit smaller. So the inspector allows us to change these things live in a browser, even if it's a page we don't own, if we want to mess around with a bit of styling. So I could go to this EM and I could edit that again. I could make that strong. And it'll show us that it's bold here, but remember, we're not actually saving anything. We're just kind of getting a look at how we can change a page. Indeed, if we go back to the original source, you see the original source did not change. So let's add a few things. We'll go ahead and add an actual strong tag. Strong indicates something that we want to emphasize. The default for strong is bold, but there again, we just say strong, not bold, because you might represent strong some other way, maybe through a different color text. Now keep in mind, you're going to have different users of different abilities. Some might not recognize colors the same way others do. So you typically want to do something in addition to color if you're using color to emphasize something. And that's another good reason to use these tags like EM and strong, is for screen readers, for differently abled people. It's able to say something that's not italics, but it's able to indicate emphasis or strong. So within the strong, we'll say, stay tuned for updates. And by the way, never put that on a web page, never put under construction on a web page, only put complete features on a web page. It's a given that web pages are always changing. So if you have a link and it just goes to an under construction, that's a way of frustrating your users. So be careful there. Let's go back and look at our page. So you see it's reset this to an H2 and this to an EM as we saw. And now you see the text stay tuned for updates, which we had earlier. You notice that stay tuned for updates is on the same line. We can do a line break with the BR tag, and then we can give it another space with another BR tag, but I emphasize caution on this. BR will give you space, and we'll see that in just a moment when we refresh this, but it's better to use cascading style sheets because they have the idea of margin and padding. And the nice thing about using CSS as opposed to using HTML is that HTML is static. It's going to look the same if you're on mobile, if you're on web, or if you're printing this out. Where CSS, you can actually change style sheets based on the platform, web, mobile, print, or anything else, so it's a lot more flexible. As a matter of fact, let me add a few more things so that we can look at how this will look in the browser. I'm going to change this to my favorite trees for Greater Cincinnati. I will also add some H3 text because I mentioned that, so we'll say H3, and I plan to add some JSON services. We'll give a BR between each of these units and save. Let's look in the browser. Refresh, and you see now it's split these up and put these on different pages. And once again, if we go to inspect, you can see that this is an H3, where the welcome to my page is an H2, and you can see a little difference in the styling of that text. Now let's consider a list of information. OL indicates an ordered or a numbered list, where UL is an unordered list, which we often think of as bullet points. Within a list, we'll typically have a set of LI tags, open and close, that surround the text. Let's look at an example. First, let me fix tabbing a little bit. Usually, whenever we have an open and close set of HTML tags, we'll tab to give a bit of visual separation. So now we see that all of our content is within body. I'm going to start with an ordered list, which means a numbered list. So open and close OL, then we'll say LI for list item, and inside of that we'll say Redbud, and then we'll do another LI and Pawpaw, and another LI and Fuji Apple. All of these great for the Cincinnati landscape. Fuji's a trademark, so we probably would want to put a trademark tag in there, but nonetheless we get the idea. Let's save, refresh our browser, and you see now we have a numbered list, Redbud, Pawpaw, Fuji Apple. You see the numbers there. Now I switched this from OL to UL, and notice that one nice thing about Visual Studio was kind enough to keep those two in sync for me. Refresh the page and notice they're now bullet points. Hyperlink. This is very important because this is how a user will navigate around our page. And you see here we have href equals hyperlink, so this is where the user is going to go. And then we close off the open tag, and then we have a close tag here, and we have text in between the two, and that's the text that the user will see on the hyperlink. Now if we look at the href, that's where we want to take the user. And there are three different styles that we can have. One is relative, which is where we have a link within our own website. Another is absolute, which is where we're linking to something outside of our website. And then finally, an anchor tag is common if we have a very large page and we want to provide navigation within that page. So notice relative, we just have the page name and we might have a directory it's in, but relative means it's relative to the page that we're currently on. That's important for a website that we create ourselves or linking within our website, because we might move directories over time, and as long as our links are relative, it makes that process a lot easier. Maybe we put something in a subdirectory or we remove a subdirectory. As long as we do that to all pages and they're relatively linked, it's a lot easier to make sure those links are still valid. Where an absolute link will often start with something like HTTP or HTTPS. So let's make a relative and absolute link. So for a relative link, we need to have it basically in our same project. So I'm going to go back and just add a very simple page again. We'll say new item, just like we did before, HTML page, and I'm going to call this one contact us.html and add. And a simple page, we'll say contact us. Okay, here is our contact info. Now again, nothing crazy there. I just want to demonstrate the concept of linking to an internal page. So under the UL, let me make an href equals, and then take a look. One nice thing about Visual Studio here is it gives us a list of our relative pages and we can just click on it. Now we could make the same type of link with any kind of text editor, but you see Visual Studio gives us a couple helping hands here. As a matter of fact, when I close out that page, or close out that A tag, the anchor tag, notice it automatically gives me a close anchor tag as well. So in between these, I simply say contact us. One note so far is that what we've done is not only HTML, but it's valid XML as well, because you notice that all of our open tags have close tags, or we have things like the BR tag, which is a singleton, where there is just one tag, there's no open and close, but we're indicating that by putting a slash on the end. All of our tag names are lowercase, all of our attributes are quoted. So far, this is a valid XML document. Not only can we view it as HTML, but we could also parse it as XML if we wanted. Refresh our page, scroll towards the bottom, and we see Contact Us, and there's our quick and dirty contact page. You notice that that is a relative link to that page. Now let's consider how to do an absolute link. We'll go back to Plant Places and grab this Eastern Redbud. I'll simply select all text and then Control-C. And now let's say I want to make this Redbud list item clickable. That's certainly possible. href equals, double quote, and then it gives me a closed double quote. I paste in that link, and then we go ahead and terminate that open anchor tag. Notice it gives me a close anchor tag, but the trick is the text is to the right of that close anchor. And that text is what I actually want to make clickable. So I'm going to go ahead and just move that close anchor tag to the right of the text like so. Refresh our page and you see that now we have a clickable link for Redbud. And when I click on Redbud, where do I go? This looks very familiar. This is that Redbud page that we were looking at just a moment ago. A wonderful plant for the Cincinnati landscape, by the way. And since we're on that page, we can grab an image and make an image tag. So image tag, a few notes about that. It's going to have the less than symbol and then IMG, and then SRC is the source of the image. Just like our hyperlink. That can either be a relative path, like you see here, a path to an image that lives on our website, or an absolute path, which oftentimes is referring to another website. One footnote though, you should really have all images local to your website. If you're linking to somebody else's website, you're really stealing their bandwidth. So you should have images local to your website, and of course make sure that you own copyright to them, or that you can use the images without copyright. If you go on a lot of the image sharing websites, they actually will let you search by images that are open license that you can use. But either way, it's really best practice to keep that loaded in your own web page instead of linking to somebody else's page. So the source of the image, and then alt text is also very important because here again, remember, different people are going to use your website and they will have different abilities. So alt text is good for those who use screen readers because they might have a visual challenge. So put in a very descriptive alt text. Don't do something like repeat the image name. Don't do that because that's not helping somebody who has a screen reader. Also make it very descriptive. Don't just make the alt text say me or a picture of me. Say what it is. Say it's a picture of me in a tie with maybe trees behind me or something like that. Describe the picture in several words, more than just one word. Now, with height and border, you can use these inline in the image tag, but it's not recommended. Instead of using those directly in the image tag, it's better to style with CSS, because here again, CSS styles can change based on how the user is interacting with your page. You can have one CSS style for print, one for web, one for mobile, and they can adapt to that look and feel that the user wants to see. One other note is don't load a full-size image into a page, maybe a humongous image, and then resize it on the page. It's a lot better to resize the image on the server side. In other words, just use some kind of tool to resize the image to a good size and send it down to the browser in that size that the browser wants to see. So don't take a big image and then use the height and width to constrain it on a web page. Instead, resize the image to be that height and width, because then your page is loading a lot faster because it's only downloading a file that's big enough to show. It doesn't have to download a much larger file and then resize it on the browser. So a few best practices there. I'm going to navigate back to www and let's add a new folder. I could call this IMG. I could call it images. We'll just go ahead and call it images. And now I'm going to right click and copy full path. This one's going to be helpful. Here's a picture I took many years ago, so I'm comfortable that I own copyright to it. So I'm going to go ahead and save this locally. I could copy it by doing copy. I'm just going to save it on my local computer by right-clicking. And remember, just a moment ago, I copied the full path to that images directory. So I can simply paste that up here, and it's going to save it to this same path on my file system. So let's see. I'm going to save this actually as JPG. So Good Shepherd Cercis canadensis. Let me simplify this. I'll just call it Redbud. Redbud.jpg. Take a look back in Visual Studio. We expand on images, and what do you see there? Redbud.jpg. So back to my page source, and I'll tell you what, right under that unordered list, but above the Contact Us, I'll add an image tag, img src equals. And then, look at that. Once again, it's going to help me out. It's going to give me that images directory that I created and the Redbud photo that I just downloaded, so I can click. There's a lot less chance I'm going to make a mistype if it's helping me select. Now we need to give it the alt text. And we know that alt text is good for those who have different abilities when they're using our web page, so it's good for people who maybe have visual impairments or something like that. One note on the Redbud tree, you notice, as I recommended, I gave it a very descriptive alt text. A redbud tree with beautiful pink blossoms. So I didn't just say redbud tree, I didn't say redbud.jpg. I actually described the picture itself, which is what you should do in alt. Now if we go back and refresh our page and scroll down, take a look at that redbud tree. So neat thing about the redbud tree, and this is specific to the redbud, make sure it's a redbud. These flowers come out before the leaves come out, so it puts on a beautiful show in early spring, usually actually around late March in the Cincinnati area. The flowers are edible, and they're great on a salad, so it's one of my favorite trees. So you notice that I can take a look at this, I can mouse over it, and here's the picture. Probably could resize this one a bit more. Once again, we can inspect, and when we inspect, we'll see things like the alt text that I added earlier. So we're not going to get into CSS just yet, but let's go ahead and start thinking about how we can style our page for CSS. And let me tell you why this is important. When I go to Plant Places and I search on something like red, you'll notice that I get a lot of results here. Now take a look at what happens when I hold Control and I press P. It brings up a print preview. Now, do you want to waste all of that color ink on printing this out? Let's say you have a list of plants you want to take to a nursery and purchase. If you were to print that page as it looks right here, imagine all that ink you would waste. On the other hand, when I hold Control and I press P, take a look. It's a much more printer-friendly style. It's just a black and white list of plants. Believe it or not, it is the exact same HTML under the covers. It's just that CSS is styling it differently for print. You notice there's no left nav. There's no top nav. Actually, there's a slightly different top nav. It says plant list from plantplaces.com. And then down at the bottom it says see more details at plannedplaces.com. So there are a few things that appear in print mode that don't appear in web mode. On a similar note, if we go into our inspector, we can actually change this a bit. We can squish this down, and you notice that when we squish it down to be about the size of a mobile phone, the left nav goes away. When we expand it out, the left nav comes back. So you see it's dynamic. And the reason why we can do that is when we're in web, we're applying one CSS style sheet. When we're in print, we're applying a different CSS style sheet. And when we are in mobile, we're applying yet another CSS style sheet. And each of these style sheets has the ability to turn on or off a different section of the page. Those sections are the things that we call div if it's an actual block, or span if it's an inline. So inline means within one line. Div could mean multiple lines. So as I mentioned, we'll cover CSS a bit later. But for now, we can go ahead and add a div tag to our page. So we'll go up to the top under body, and we'll do an open div. And we'll typically give it a class or an ID, which is a way we can identify it. So for this one, I'm going to say class equals content. And it will automatically give me that closed div. I'm going to take the closed div and I'm going to put it right below our contact us. And you notice that Visual Studio is kind enough to indent the entire page for me. If we go back and refresh our page, we see, well, there's no change to the page's look and feel, and that's okay, because the div tag is just a way of marking sections of our page that CSS can turn on, turn off, or do different stylings with. So we shouldn't actually see a visual representation, but it's still there. And once again, if I do a Control U, you'll see there's our div class equals content. A few other tags we want to look at, and I'm not going to demonstrate these in this video, but just FYI, table should be used only for tabular data. Back in the day, we used to use tables for formatting a page as well, but it didn't have that div flexibility that I just showed you. In other words, if you use a table to format a page, you can't turn on and off parts of that page easily for web, print, and mobile. So you should only really use table for truly tabular data. Take a look again at our plant result page for the name red, and what you'll see is that each of the plants has its own row, followed by a series of pictures. So this is a table, it is tabular data, and that's when you should use a table. You'll typically see a table tag to start everything off, TH tags will be the headings, and then TR tags for each of the rows. And within the rows, TD tags are each of the cells. So if I right-click and do inspect on this table, you see I did Whopper Red with Bronze Leaf Begonia. You see that's in a TD, and then the next box is a TD, and the next box is a TD. The entire row is a TR. Let me expand this out so you can maybe, well, I'll tell you what. I actually kind of like it like that better. We go up to the top, and you see here are our headings. In that case, looks like I used TD, but I could have used TH for that just as well. And then I have a special title text up here. But nonetheless, you'll see each one of these TR tags represents an individual plant, and within that it has a series of TD tags that represent each of the cells that you see in this table. So that table is good for tabular data, and we know that we use that exact same table, but a different style for that table when we're in print mode. And once again, reinforcing something I mentioned earlier, HTML should just be for structure and content of the data on your page. Use CSS for styling. I have a whole series of videos on CSS. There's really a lot of neat things that you can do with it. And I hope by seeing that difference of web, mobile, and print, and looking at how you can use the exact same HTML and use CSS to change the look and feel to be appropriate for the way the user's interacting with your page, I hope I've whetted your appetite a little bit for what's to come when we look at CSS. So as always, I hope this video has been helpful, and I look forward to reading your comments. Thank you.